Chapters 19 and 20 of the Maxwell Mystery by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 19. Red Ink Spots. I resolved to say nothing more about the fan or the spangles to any member of the household, but to lay the case before Hunt when he came over to the house the next morning. To my surprise he did not seem at all impressed with the idea of Miss Gardner being implicated. "You let your idea of clues run away with you, Mr. King," he said. "To be sure the spangles may point in Miss Gardner's direction, but she certainly cannot be the intruder who came in the motor coat and cap. Now it seems to me if we're going to look for our man through any clues, we'd better consider that red ink. When Miss Leslie threw that inkstand, and so much ink was spilled on the rug, it is extremely probable that some also spattered on the coat of the assailant." "Well, it seems to me," I said, "that's about the most elusive clue you could think of. We can't possibly after all these days trace a motor coat with red ink spots on it." "He might have taken it to a cleaner's," said Hunt thoughtfully. "Then we shall advertise for a cleaner who has had such a job recently." But my sarcasm was lost upon Hunt. "I doubt if a cleaner could take out such spots," he went on. "Red ink is almost indelible." "Well, I have little hope of finding these mythical spots on a mythical coat belonging to a mythical man." "You're wrong there, for certainly the coat and the man are not mythical. Miss Leslie saw them. Perhaps she can tell us if the red ink spattered him," said Hunt hopefully. "She can't tell us anything at present. The doctor won't let her be spoken to on this subject. It seems to me, Hunt, the only thing to do is to call in the police. Of course if they find the man and the coat some red ink spots on it would go a long way toward proving his guilt. But I'm sure that to find the man will require the skill of the police force rather than our ineffectual attempts." "Perhaps you're right," agreed Hunt, "but all the same I shall try to find that coat." Then Tom Whiting and his wife appeared at the library door. "We want you, Mr. King, if Mr. Hunt will excuse you," said Edith Whiting in her pleasant way. "Certainly," said Mr. Hunt. "I am just going home, anyway." "Have you discovered anything new?" asked Tom Whiting. "We hope to do so," said Mr. Hunt. "I think we are on the right track, though we have not progressed very far as yet." "We want you to go with us for a motor ride, Mr. King," said Edith Whiting to me. "Tom insists on my going, and we are taking Irene with us." We started away, but Hunt called me back to whisper a parting message. "If you find any strangers in automobile togs," he said, "observe carefully whether there are any signs of their having tried to erase red ink spots from the lower fronts of their coats." "That's the slimmest kind of a slim chance yet," I said, almost smiling at the idea. "But I promise you if I find an automobilist spattered with red ink, I will arrest him at once." I found the others ready and waiting for me. It seemed pathetic to ride away in Philip's big automobile, but as Tom Whiting had said, the ladies really needed some fresh air, and he thought the trip would do us all good. Mr. Maxwell and Miss Miranda insisted on our going, and so we started off. Mr. and Mrs. Whiting sat in front, for Tom was quite as good a chauffeur as Philip had been, and Miss Gardner and I sat behind. As there was ample room for another, Irene proposed that we stop for Gilbert Crane. This we did, and he seemed glad to accept the invitation. It scarcely seemed like the same party who a few days before, accompanied by Philip, had traveled so merrily over these same roads. On our return Mrs. Whiting asked Mr. Crane to come in to luncheon with us, and he accepted. He alighted before I did, and as he stood waiting to help Miss Gardner out, the midday sunlight shone full upon him. I looked at him curiously, thinking what a large, fine-looking fellow he was physically, and how becoming his fashionable automobile coat was to him. Its color was a light brownish gray, and as my eye rested idly upon it, I suddenly noticed something that made my heart stand still. On the front of this same coat, on the lower edge, were several small spots, visible only in the brightest sunlight, which, whatever they might be, had every appearance of being red ink. To say I was stunned would pretty well express my feelings, but I was learning now not to show surprise at unexpected developments. I went into the house with the rest, and finding that Mr. Hunt had gone, I sent a note to him by one of the servants, asking him to return at 2:00. He came just as we finished luncheon, and bidding him go in the library and await me there, I went into Mr. Maxwell's study. Finding my host there as I had hoped, and not wishing to elevate my voice, I scribbled on a bit of paper a request that Mr. Maxwell would ask Mr. Crane to come into his study, and would keep him there securely for 20 minutes at least. Mr. Maxwell read the paper quietly, handed it back to me, gave me a quick nod of comprehension, and immediately went in search of Gilbert Crane. A moment later I saw him return with Gilbert Crane. They entered the study and closed the door, so I knew that the coast was clear, and that for 20 minutes I need fear no interruption from them. Eagerly seizing his coat from the hat stand where he had flung it, I hastened to the library. I found Hunt there, and after closing the door I held up the coat for his inspection. "You don't mean to say you have found the man?" he cried. "I don't know about that," I said very soberly, "but I have certainly found a coat that ought to be looked after. What do you make of this?" I held the front of the coat toward the window to catch the bright sunlight, and drew Hunt's attention to the almost invisible spots on it. He looked at them in silence a moment, and then said abruptly, "Get some more blotters." We dampened the blotters and applied them very carefully, for the spots were faint and the surface of the cloth dusty. But the results showed strong evidence that the stains were similar to those on the carpet. "Whose coat is it?" said Hunt, though I think he knew. "Gilbert Crane's," I answered, looking straight at the detective. "But that does not prove that Gilbert Crane committed the murder," he responded, looking at me with equal directness. "It does not," I said emphatically, "but it is certainly a clue that must lead somewhere. And we must follow it wherever it leads." "Yes," I assented. "Now that we have something to work on, let us get to work. Shall I call Crane up here and ask him if he can explain these spots on his coat? Somehow I can't help thinking that he could do so." "Not yet," said Mr. Hunt. "I think it wiser to straighten out a few points before we speak to Mr. Crane on the subject. He is a peculiar man, and I don't want to antagonize him. I would much rather, if you please, that you would replace the coat where you found it, let Mr. Maxwell know that he need not detain Mr. Crane any longer, and then bring Miss Gardner back here with you for a short consultation." I followed Mr. Hunt's suggestions to the letter, but it was with a rapidly sinking heart. Not for a moment did I think Gilbert Crane a villain, and yet there were many circumstances that looked dark against him. I was also disturbed at Mr. Hunt's request for Irene. A strange foreboding made me fear that some dreadful revelation was about to take place. The jury had rendered its verdict of "wilful murder by a person unknown," and I fervently hoped the criminal might remain forever unknown, rather than that the shadow of guilt might fall on any one who had been hospitably received at Maxwell Chimneys. Still, in the cause of justice, every possibility must be considered, and I knew that Mr. Hunt would shirk no duty, but would doggedly follow any clue that presented itself. I looked in at the study door, and the merest lifting of my eyebrows was sufficient to inform Mr. Maxwell that a detention of Gilbert was no longer necessary. I looked at young Crane's inscrutable face, and was obliged to admit to myself that it was not a frank countenance in its general effect. But I resolved that this fact should not be allowed to prejudice me against him. Finding Mrs. Whiting in the hall, and learning from her that Miss Gardner had gone to her own room, I asked her to say to Miss Gardner that Mr. Hunt desired to see her in the library. Mrs. Whiting promised to send Irene there at once, and greatly dreading the interview, I returned to the library myself. I found Hunt making a tabulated statement of certain facts. "You see, Mr. King," he said, with a very grave face, "while these things are not positively incriminating, they are serious questions which need clearing up. Granting that the bronze horse was thrown at the intruder and replaced on the desk before you entered the room that night, we must allow that it was picked up and replaced by somebody. Miss Leslie was incapable of this act. The murderer was not likely to do it. Gilbert Crane was the first to find out that the tragedy had occurred. There is no witness to say what he might or might not have done in this room. It is possible, therefore, that he restored the horse to its place." "And the inkstand?" "You remember that Gilbert Crane insisted on spending the night in this house. Is it not, therefore, conceivable that he should have waited until every one else had gone home, or retired to their rooms, and that he should then have come to the library, found the empty stand, refilled it, and replaced it?" "But," said I in utter amazement, "if he did not commit the crime, why should he be so careful about these details?" "I am not sure," said Mr. Hunt in a low voice, "that he did not commit the crime." 20. Irene tells the truth. Although horrified and even indignant at Mr. Hunt's assertion, I could not fail to be impressed by his arguments. I was still bewildered at the possibilities he suggested, when a tap was heard at the library door. Mr. Hunt rose quietly and admitted Miss Gardner. The girl looked haggard and worn; her brilliant coloring seemed faded, and her whole attitude betrayed deep distress not unmixed with fear. But all of this she tried to hide beneath a mask of impassivity. I think she impressed Hunt with her appearance of calmness, though I felt sure that her turbulent spirit was far from placid. "Sit down, Miss Gardner," said Hunt kindly. "I wish to ask you a few questions." Irene sat down, and with an air both haughty and dignified, awaited the detective's next words. Had it not been for her restless, troubled eyes, she would have deceived me into thinking her assumed indifference real. "In your testimony, Miss Gardner," began Mr. Hunt, "you declared that you did not leave the spot where you were sitting, on the east end of the balcony, the night of the murder, until you came into the house at about 10:30. Are you still prepared to swear to this statement?" "Why should I not be, Mr. Hunt?" said Irene, but her lips grew white and her voice trembled. "You might have since recollected that you did go around to the west side, if only for a moment." "I have no recollections that cause me to change my sworn statement in any way," declared Irene. Her voice had sunk almost to a whisper, and her eyes refused to meet mine. Mr. Hunt continued. "Were you around on the west side, near the library window, at any time during the evening? Earlier, perhaps, than the time you spent sitting alone on the east side?" "No," said Irene, and this time her voice was stronger, and her whole air more decided as she looked the detective straight in the eye. "I was not on the west balcony earlier in the evening. I was not there at all." The last sentence came with a desperate burst of emphasis that somehow did not carry conviction. For some reason the girl was under a severe tension, and I couldn't help thinking there was danger of her physical collapse. "Then," said Mr. Hunt, suddenly producing the black spangles, "then may I ask, Miss Gardner, how these chanced to be found in the library, and on the library window shutter?" Irene Gardner gave a low cry, and hiding her face in her hands, seemed in immediate danger of the collapse I had feared. "Miss Gardner," I said, for though her actions were inexplicable, I was still deeply under the spell of her fascination, and greatly desired to help her. "Miss Gardner, let me advise you, as a friend, to tell your story frankly and truthfully. I am sure it will be better for all concerned." Raising her head, Irene Gardner flashed a look at me so full of faith and gratitude that, assured of her complete innocence, I determined to become her strong ally. "Oh," she exclaimed, "I would be so glad to tell the truth. I swore to a falsehood from a sense of duty to another." "It is always a mistaken sense of duty that leads to false swearing," said Mr. Hunt. "I believe that is so," said Irene earnestly. "But I had no one to advise me, and I thought I was doing right. The truth is, then, that I did go around to the west end of the balcony, and that I did look in at the library window." "At what time was this?" asked Mr. Hunt. "I don't know," said Irene. "But it was just before Mr. Judson came, and about 10 minutes later Mr. King came to me on the front balcony, and told me what had happened." "What did you see in the library?" asked Mr. Hunt. "Must I tell that?" "You must." "Then I saw Philip lying on the floor, and Mildred fallen to the floor also; but she was partly hidden by the desk." "Is that all you saw?" asked Mr. Hunt, looking at her intently. "Was there no one else in the room?" "Must I tell that?" asked Irene again, with an appealing glance at me. "Yes," said Mr. Hunt sternly. "Much may depend on your telling the absolute truth." "Then," said Irene, "I saw Mr. Crane placing a pistol in Mildred's hand." "Wait," said I. "Was this occurring just as you arrived at the window?" "Yes." "Then," I went on, "you cannot swear that he was placing the pistol in her hand. He might have been taking it away from her, or attempting to do so." "I never thought of that," said Irene, an expression of relief lighting up her face. "Even so," said Mr. Hunt, "he should have told of the incident in his own testimony. What did you do next, Miss Gardner?" "I went away at once. I went to the east side of the veranda. I was so mystified and horrified by what I had just seen that I flung myself into a chair and cried. I was still crying when, soon after, Mr. Judson came in search of me. And I was still crying when Mr. King came later to tell me what had happened." "She was," I said, "and crying so violently that I was alarmed. But as Miss Maxwell appeared almost immediately, I left the two ladies to look after each other." "And had it not been for the incriminating spangles, did you not intend to correct your misstatement?" said Mr. Hunt, looking at her severely. "No," said Irene, and her manner now was frank and self assured. "For I felt sure Mr. Crane had done nothing wrong, and I did not wish to attract any unfounded suspicions toward him." "A suspicion that is really unfounded can do no one any harm," said Mr. Hunt, who seemed to be in a mood for oracular utterances. "I am glad," said Irene simply, "for I would not wish any harm to come to Mr. Crane through my testimony." "That is as it may be," said Mr. Hunt, and the interview was at an end. Although Irene's evidence had placed Gilbert in a doubtful position, I was not yet willing to believe the man guilty, or even that he was implicated in the crime. Indeed, I was for going straight to him and asking him for the explanation which I felt sure he could give. But Mr. Hunt did not agree with me. He was in the grasp of a new theory, and therefore subject to the temptation which too often assails a detective, to make the facts coincide with it. "No," he said, "don't let us go ahead too rapidly. Let us formulate a definite proposition, and then see if we are warranted in assuming it to be a true one. In the first place, whoever killed Phillip Maxwell must have had a strong personal motive for the deed. There is no reason to suspect an ordinary burglar, for there is nothing whatever to indicate burglary in the whole affair. If Phillip Maxwell had any personal enemies, the fact is not known to us. Even his uncle is unaware of the existence of any such. The only man we know of who might have had an ill feeling toward Phillip Maxwell, mind I say might have had, is Gilbert Crane. We know that an antagonism existed between the two men on account of Miss Leslie. While it would not seem to us that this antagonism was sufficient to develop a crime, yet parallel cases are not unknown. Gilbert Crane is a man of deep passions, fiery temper, and uncontrollable impulses. He is erratic, eccentric, and while I do not wish to judge him too harshly, I must admit he seems to be of the stuff of which villains are made." "But none of this is definitely incriminating," I said, appalled at the sudden directness of Hunt's attack. "No," he replied, "and that is why I am not willing to proceed as if it were, or as if I so considered it. It is absurd, anyway," I said almost angrily, "for you know that he was in the billiard room at exactly 10 o'clock. I saw him there myself; and according to Miss Maxwell, the shots were fired at 10 o'clock. Yes, according to Miss Maxwell. But it has occurred to me that hers is the only evidence that the shots were fired at 10 o'clock, and we are by no means certain that her clock or watch was exactly right." "The clock in the study was right," I said doggedly. "It always is. Mr. Maxwell is very particular about that." Yes, but ladies are not apt to be so exact with their timepieces. At any rate, I shall make it my business to find out." "Let us find out now," I said eagerly. "If there is anything in this horrible theory, I want to know it at once." "Go yourself," said Hunt. "Go at once, and ask Miss Maxwell as to the accuracy of her clock." I found Miss Maxwell alone, and I asked her in a casual manner how she knew it was 10 o'clock when she heard, or thought she heard, the 2 pistol shots. "It was 10 by the little clock on my dressing table," she replied. "I am sure of that, for it was striking at the time I heard the reports." "And is that clock always right?" I asked. "No," she said. "In fact, it is almost never right. For some time I have been intending to have it regulated." "Is it slow or fast?" I asked, trying to preserve my casual manner. "It runs slow," she said. "And that night it must have been as much as 10 minutes slow, because I remember I was late for dinner, though I thought I was in ample time." "You should have stated this discrepancy sooner, Miss Maxwell," I said, unable to keep a note of grave concern out of my voice. "Why?" she returned in astonishment. "I had no idea that would make any difference. In fact, I didn't think anything about it. How can it make any difference?" "Never mind, Miss Maxwell," I said soothingly. "Perhaps it won't make any difference. Don't give it any further thought. You have quite enough trouble as it is." "Oh, I have indeed," said the dear old lady. "I don't know what I shall do, Mr. King. Philip's death has affected my brother terribly. He was always a quiet man, but now he is so crushed and heartbroken that he is more silent than ever. And I can't seem to comfort him. I think we will have to go away from Maxwell Chimneys. We have a sister out West, and I think we will go out there. I am sure that entire and permanent change of scene is the only thing that will help Alexander at all." I looked admiringly at the dear lady whose unselfish spirit thought of her brother's comfort, ignoring her own sorrow, and assuring her of my sincere sympathy and my assistance in every possible way, I returned to Hunt. "I am not surprised," he said, when I told him that Miss Maxwell's clock had undoubtedly been 10 minutes slow on Monday evening. "It is alarming the way the links fit into the chain of evidence, but it must be more than mere coincidence. Look at it this way for a moment. Supposing, for the sake of argument, that events proceeded like this. You saw Gilbert Crane in the billiard room at 10 o'clock. This you are sure of. Now, according to Crane's own statement, he looked into Mr. Maxwell's study some 20 minutes later. But we have no other witness for this. Mr. Maxwell says he neither heard nor saw him, and Crane himself admits that he did not. With the exception of Miss Gardner on the balcony, the guests were all in the music room, not only absorbed in their music, but making a great deal of noise. Miss Maxwell was in her own bedroom, and the servants were busy in the kitchens, of which the doors were closed. As nearly as I can find out, Gilbert Crane came running downstairs for Dr. Sheldon a few moments before 10:30. If you have followed my reasoning you will see that his whereabouts between 10 o'clock and say 10:25 are unaccounted for, except by himself. His coat, the automobile coat on which we have discovered the red spots, hung on the hat stand in the back part of the hall. He therefore had ample opportunity to leave the billiard room, put on his coat and the cap and goggles which he always carries in that coat pocket, go up the back staircase, and through the hall window at the head of that staircase out on to the west balcony. The library window is directly next to the hall window. He had therefore, I say, both time and opportunity to fire the shots at about 10 minutes after 10, which would accord with Miss Maxwell's inaccurate testimony. He had also time and opportunity to return downstairs the way he came, restore his coat to its place on the hat stand, and go back to the billiard room. This yet left sufficient time for him to go upstairs again, the front stairs this time, in full view of the people in the music room if they chanced to look, and return to make his startling announcement to Dr. Sheldon. I had followed Hunt's words with such intense interest that I seemed to be living through the successive scenes myself. As he paused, I remarked thoughtfully, "And that would explain why Philip cried out, 'Oh, to think that he should shoot me!'" "Yes," said Hunt gravely, "it explains a great many things. It explains, of course, the spots on his coat." "Wait!" I cried eagerly. "When the ink spattered on his coat it must also have fallen on his shoes and the bottoms of his trousers." "Not necessarily on his trousers," said Hunt, "for the coat is long and large, and would probably entirely protect them. As to his shoes, they have doubtless been blackened since, and so all trace would be lost." "As a chain of circumstantial evidence it is certainly complete," I said, with a sigh, "but all my intuitions cry out against its being the truth." "Have you any other theory to offer?" "Not the shadow of one. I only wish I had. But stay. What do you make of Miss Gardner's assertion that she saw Gilbert placing a pistol in Miss Leslie's hand?" "I think she is mistaken as to what he was doing. I think Miss Leslie's story is true in every detail. Possibly Mr. Crane endeavored to take the pistol out of her hand, then changing his mind, for some reason, concluded not to do so." I sat staring at Mr. Hunt, almost stunned by his convincing arguments. "What will be your next move?" I asked. "I shall submit this report to Inspector Davis, and he must do whatever he thinks best." End of chapters 19 and 20.